Hello, I'm Richard with Janus Motorcycles, and in today's parts talk, we're going to talk about the fuel tanks on our motorcycles, taking a look specifically at the Halcyon fuel tank. One of the first things that the most unique things about our tank is that it is not steel. It's an aluminum fuel tank. That is has a long history in motorcycling, especially in motorcycle racing, just because of the lightweight. When we first started off, however, we were thinking steel, which actually kind of reflects the history of motorcycles. The very first motorcycles used a steel fuel tank because they were being built in the late 19th century, and aluminum just wasn't a material that was available. Like most of the early motorcycles, we used steel, and I think by the time we finished finally getting a thing we could work with, it weighed almost, or maybe slightly over 20 pounds with all the brackets and weldments fitted. The other major problem with the mild steel is because there's so much welding in the process that we use to make our fuel tanks, the heat going into that steel was just building up and collecting, and it was warping, unavoidable warping that we could not figure out how to get rid of while welding. So aluminum was the next choice because aluminum also has a history starting in the 1930s, really mainly in the 1930s, it started being used in motorcycle applications, and primarily the fuel tank. There were some early attempts at monocoque aluminum chassis and integrated frame fuel tanks, but for the most part, racing motorcycles from the 40s started using aluminum fuel tanks, and some earlier than that. So it's kind of a neat precedent for aluminum. The other benefit of aluminum is that it will oxidize, but it's not in the same way that steel will, where it will flash rust inside your fuel tank. And then if you've ever restored a motorcycle or are familiar with vintage motorcycles, one of the first things you want to do is go in there, open up the fuel cap and look inside and see, is this thing rusted? Is it rusting from the inside out? Because most automotive applications, rust starts from the inside and it works its way out. And it may look okay on the outside, but then you have pinholes and it's just a nightmare. So our background in restoration really also encouraged us to make this move to aluminum because it's not going to oxidize like steel. So I mentioned a little bit about the way we make our fuel tanks, which is a little different than other people. We are a very small shop. We were able to launch a product within 6 months of starting the company. The first Halcyon 50 was rolling by summer after we founded the company in the winter. And what allows us to do that is not having just incredibly extensive tooling and costs built into that. We just make a lot of things by hand. So the fuel tank for the Halcyon started off looking much like this piece of aluminum right here. Still does, actually. The first ones we would have drawn, we made in cardboard, and we just kind of like gradually worked up something that would work, trimming, shaping, seeing how it would fit together. So it really was a part of our motorcycle that was designed on the shop floor. Eventually, once we are still working on the Halcyon tank. Always, we're constantly making little adjustments that make it easier to manufacture. But eventually, when we arrived at a more formalized and finished version, that was a laser cut file that was then, this is a little bit before that time, I believe, but there's a laser cut file that comes out, and then that gets, those different parts get formed. So that doesn't mean a big stamp that makes it any shape you want. It makes it into, like on the Halcyon fuel tank, for example, there are these really distinctive brakes, and they're for multiple reasons I'll talk about in a little bit. But that's the first process, and then they shape the edges with another stamp. It used to be that we hand hammered all these, but we do have a process where they put it in a brake and press it, and then it gets formed just like very, very uniformly. But kind of getting back to what I was saying about the way that we make these is that because it's made out of sheet metal, hand-formed aluminum, there's a lot of points where it needs to be welded together. So this has to be welded, this has to be welded, this has to be welded, all the way around the front. The fuel, the filler neck has to be welded in, the petcock and the vent tube all to it. So there's just an incredible amount of heat that is going into these. There's hours of welding in a fuel tank, not to mention the forming and tack welding. So that's one of the reasons that what we do is a little different. It also makes a really unique tank and a really strong and a very, very lightweight tank. These aluminum tanks, I mean, this is a fully finished Halcyon fuel tank right here. This is the finished product. This will be finished in everything but paint. So this would be almost ready. What we'll do is that we'll do a final finish of this, like a final sanding before it is sent out to powder coat. Then they'll do a wash with an acetone or a really strong solvent to make sure that all the oils and contaminants are removed from the tank. Then they powder coat it. That's when it comes back to us to be pinstriped with the logo and the graphics. And whether or not you get deluxe fuel tank or not is decided before we do that. The story of these tanks is a long one. You know, the Halcyon tank is one that we've worked on the longest. It's been since the 50cc days, and as I mentioned, we do constantly update these. So actually, since this tank has been made or partially made, we've completely redone the way that we manufacture this so that it's easier for us to make and requires less sanding, because you can imagine with all those welds how much sanding is required to get it to the point where it looks like this. One of the things I'll also just talk about real quick is all the parts that go into a fuel tank that are not just the metal forming. There's the filler neck. So this is extends about 2 inches down into the tank, and then there's the vent system. And so the vent system allows for the filler neck, you can seal. It has an O-ring here, and it seals the tank. So you can imagine if you were to just like put a hole in the bottom, the petcock letting gas out, eventually it would develop a vacuum and not let any more fuel out once it reached a vacuum point. So we have a vent tube. That's actually what this is. Goes up into the tank almost to the very top. And it has a little hood over the top of this. This is actually the machine piece. And what that allows is you can splash the gas around, but almost minimal amount will be able to get out because it has to pass through this little annulus here. And that vents the tube. And that's kind of a unique design to us. I'm not sure how many other people use a similar system with a machine part like that. Then the other components that we make for this would be the fuel cap. All the machining for this is done by a fellow about 5 minutes down the road from Goshen. This is the fuel cap. Everything is machined from 6061 aluminum, and then this one has a Delrin plastic threads, which prevent it from ever having any galling or sticking once it's tightened down. If it were to, let's say, get hot in the sun, you can have these laser engraved with either Janus Motorcycles logo or a custom logo. So that's basically the story of the Halcyon tank. The last thing I'll talk about is the brakes in this fuel tank. These are a product which is kind of emblematic of the way we do things here at Janus, of not so much an aesthetic decision as a functional one. So originally this would have been a flat piece across the top, and it was still buckling. All that welding was still, especially this welding the filler neck in, it was pulling the top down. And so actually the manager, the owner of our fabrication shop, Leroy, suggested was, why don't you put a V brake down the top of this to reinforce it? And so this is one of those this is the V brake that you may be familiar with this from things like an HVAC duct on the side of it. It provides a rigidity in a flat panel of metal. And lo and behold, it worked perfectly. We were really impressed, and then we noticed that Leroy also manufactures on the side brush hogs and a whole line of farm equipment. And there was a brush hog with this big aluminum cowling on the front covering the belt, and it had a V in it. And yeah, that's where this came from. So we have a debt of gratitude to a lot of much less polished machines in the Halcyon tank. But as I mentioned, that is one of the distinctive characteristics of what we do here at Janus. Is a lot of the decisions we make are based in what our limitations, our manufacturing limitations are, because we don't operate in a vacuum. We operate in a system with 50, 60-year-old brake presses, some of them dating back to World War II. Very simple equipment. Our entire fabrication shop is run off of a generator, not off of the grid. It's an Amish shop. So it's a kind of an antiquated process, but it in the end results in a finished product which is really almost more beautiful because of it. So that's the short story of the Halcyon fuel tank, and really the other fuel tanks are very similar to that. They have different shapes for the different models. But I hope you enjoyed that, and look forward to doing another parts talk next week.